welcome to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. So today I will be demonstrating on how to paint this cute little white mice in a snowy environment, peeping from its home in a tree trunk. I'll be using Canson cold press watercolor paper 300 grams per square meter, and the size of this painting is A6, which is half of this A5 pad. So I also have another painting of a mice in a winter scenery. So if you're interested, the video link is in the description. So if you notice, the sketch of the mice is pretty basic, nothing complicated. And before I start painting, I'm going to pre-wet the mice sketch with some clean water, because I'm going to do this using the wet on wet technique, as I want the fur to appear soft in nature. So wet on wet technique would be the best way to do it. And after pre-wetting, I'm mixing in some magenta with a little hint of burnt sienna to arrive at a dark blush shade. And I'm applying this blush colored shade to stain the white mice nose and ear areas, as well as its tiny little hands or feet. So since this is a very small area to paint, I am using my micro brush to help me with the staining. And if there's too much of pigment movement or bleeding onto areas that it shouldn't bleed, just clean them up with a damp brush or a dry paper towel. Done with the blush, now I need some cool grey shade. So I'm mixing ultramarine with sapphire and also a hint of burnt sienna to arrive at this color. If you have a ready-made grey, you can use that. So I'm gonna paint the mice face and ears using this grey shade, and once again I am using the micro brush, since the my sketch is quite small. So if your sketch is on a bigger size paper, or your sketch size itself is bigger, then of course you'll be comfortable to use a bigger size brush. And of course I'm painting this using the wet on wet technique. So if your mice sketch has dried, you just need to pre-wet the painting area and start applying the paint washes. So even though it's a white furred mice or albino mice, well, in order to accentuate something that's white in color, we will have to use a grey shade so that you get to see its features, the mice features, or any other animal which is white furred, as in polar bear, a white cat, and so on. So this grey colored shade helps to indicate the darker part of the mice face and ears in a form of shadow in areas that are away from light source. So your painting would appear in a 3D perspective instead of appearing white and flat. And as I'm painting, I'm trying to just control the pigment values by lifting out additional pigment on areas that are supposed to appear lighter and so on. So in other words, I'm just trying to modify the tonal values. So you can make adjustments like this while the paint is still wet. So moving on, I'm mixing some sapphire with ultramarine to get an even darker grey shade. I'm going to paint this onto the mice eye. Can be pretty challenging to paint this narrow area, so make sure you use the micro brush once again, and also ensure that the painting is dry. And over here I am trying to lift out some pigment to create the highlights, but unfortunately it is too small, but I'll come back to that later. So next I'm going to paint the background, which is the hole in the tree trunk first, and I'm also pre-wetting it with some clean water. And once done, I'm going to drop in the same gray shade that I had earlier, but with more mixes of ultramarine blue, so it has a more bluish hint onto it. And I'm dropping it using the micro brush once again, since I don't want to stain the mice painting itself, so I have to be careful on these corners where the white area meets the sketch of the mice. As you apply the paint, if you notice there are some areas which doesn't have the wetness or pre-wet area, do not worry. After applying the wet paint, you can just use your damp brush to bleed the pigment further. You can keep adding more pigment as you foresee needed. I'm just dabbing or touching the wet paint with a clean damp brush, which is my micro brush, to achieve some snowflake effect. If you're afraid that this effect might spoil the look of your painting, you can test it out on another sheet of watercolor paper. But do try it out, because watercolor is a medium where you can do tons of experiment and get magical effect out of it. Alright, so time to paint the entire tree trunk. So once again I am pre-wetting the unpainted areas, which is the white area, with some clean water. And after that I'm going to drop in mixture of brown paint shade, which is a combination of burnt sienna and sapphire, so you'll arrive at a dark brown shade. And I'm using this paint mix to paint first the lip of the hole on the tree, and after that I will be painting the entire tree trunk with a much more darker shade. So based on the second darker brown shade, I would say there is more of sapphire into this paint mix. So you can use any color of your choice as long as it appears much darker than the lip of the hole. And over here I am also dropping in a little bit of olive green yellowish shade, just to create some impression of marks or stains on a tree. Once again mixing more sapphire paint, and this time I am using a rigger brush to create some fine lines or details on the tree trunk. Some paint spatters to create the snowflakes effect, and I'm using a white gouache. You can use acrylic, and just spatter it using a brush with hard bristle. You can use old toothbrush to achieve this spatter effect. Applying some of that white paint onto the mice eyes, as I said earlier, I couldn't achieve the highlights, so this is the right time to apply the white paint as highlights on its eyes. So moving on, I would like to create an impression of fluffy white fur on the mice, since it is a snowy ambient, so I thought a fluffy white fur would do some trick. So in order to do that, I am pre-wetting the mice painting once again with clean water, and after that I am applying a little bit of that white paint that I had earlier for the paint spatters, and I'm using the micro brush once again just to focus applying that wet paint onto the pre-wet areas, especially nearby its nose and the corners of the mice head and ears. As I paint this, I'm pretty sure it may not be that obvious on the screen, but as you paint it, I'm sure you would witness it for yourself. Just a touch up on the mice eyes, so I'm just repainting it with the dark grey shade. So I need to define the mice features further, since it looks a bit faded right now. So I'm using a light wash of grey paint that I used earlier for the first layer of the mice painting. I'm just applying it using the micro brush once again, and after applying this wet paint onto the dry painting of the mice, I'm going to give it some light washes with a clean damp brush to soften its effect. A little bit of the dark grey shade as a shadow effect underneath the mice, and after applying this wet paint, I'm going to brush it off with a clean damp brush to soften the hard edges. So I will have to repaint as a second layer the tree trunk, as it looks a bit faded at this point of time. So once again the same deep brown shade mix. I'm going to paint this using the wet on dry technique. So the first layer was done on wet technique, and the second layer I'm just applying wet paint onto the dry painting. Notice that as I repaint the tree trunk, I am not painting over the lip of the hole, as I said that should be on a lighter shade. And once again I am using purely Saphia and repainting the textures or marks on a tree trunk using the rigger brush, similar to what I did on the first layer. As I have repainted the entire tree trunk, so obviously the earlier snowfall effect has been wiped out. So once again I am creating the paint spatter to create the impression of snowfall, but this time I am just using my rigger brush to create these spatters. Extending that white paint in a form of frost or ice, snow that has accumulated onto the tree trunk itself. So over here I'm spraying the entire painting with some water spray just to make the white paint spatters bleed further and achieve much more softer look of the snow effect. So try it out. I believe you will be mesmerized seeing that white paint blooming into soft white flowers, similar to a soft snowfall or snowflakes. You can stop. Once you're happy with the paint spatters, I'm just got overexcited with the snowfall effect over here. Alright, once the painting has completely dried, time to paint in some of those fine details, such as the whiskers. So I'm using a light wash of grey paint mix, and I'm using a script brush to paint in these fine lines. You can also extend it towards its ears and head. In order to define the mice hands and nose, I'm using a little bit of magenta and just making some minor brush strokes just to sharpen the look of its nostrils, its tiny little mouth, as well as its fingers on its hands. So, final round of paint spatters as a snowfall effect. I'm using a toothbrush this time just to create some variety in the white paint spatters. If you want a more controlled appearance of the dots or paint spatters, you can just apply it directly, use your brush. And there you go, cute little white mice in a snowy ambience peeping through its home. So if you find this tutorial fun and educational, then do hit the like, share and subscribe button if you haven't. And thank you for watching. I'll see you in another tutorial. Bye.